Welcome to AFOA Canada's fourth webinar in the series themed Resiliency in Challenging Times. We are sharing resources and information that can help you navigate through the ever-changing events during this unprecedented time. If you have any questions during the presentation, please add them in the Q&A or chat window. There will be a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please note that there will also be polling questions throughout the webinar, so please submit your answers. And then please visit our website for more information and to view the recordings and slides that will be added to the webinar page. Today, our presentation is themed 6 Evolving Practices in Indigenous Government Finances and Performance Reporting. We will review the following: strategic financial reporting, not audits or compliance, 10-year grants, ISC, and financial administration law, FAL, enhanced borrowing, First Nations Market Housing Fund, Indigenous governments and own source revenue, taxation, moral control over lands, Lands Advisory Board, and comprehensive community planning. This webinar will be presented by Gordon Holley, co-founder and president of Humanity Financial Management. Welcome to AFOA Canada's second webinar series. Over to you, Gordon.
Wonderful, thanks, Douglas. Let me share my screen here. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see my slides now. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the country you're calling in from. My name is Gordon Holley, and as Douglas mentioned, I am the president and CEO of Humanity Financial Management, a CPA firm in West Vancouver, BC. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. We're going to be talking about some of the evolving practices in Indigenous government finances and performance reporting. As we come together to consider opportunities to improve governance and reporting, it's also important to look back and reflect on where we've come from. Our team is working to further understand the impact of colonization on our communities and to integrate decolonization practices and understandings into our work. Before we get into the slides, a little bit about me and where I come from. My father's family comes from Germany. They migrated to Eastern Canada in the mid-1800s and gradually moved west to the West Coast. My mother's family migrated to Edmonton from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, and I was born in a region which is now known as Prince George, BC. This is the traditional territories of the Lheidli T'enneh people. I have been an uninvited guest in the territory that we now call the municipality of West Vancouver. Today, I would like to acknowledge that my family lives and works in the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and stolen lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, for stewarding these beautiful lands for thousands of years. And just a bit of background about our firm and what we do. In May of this year, we became a certified B Corporation. This means that we commit to considering all stakeholders of our company and our decisions. In every decision that we make, we consider the impact of our decisions on our team members, on our clients, our suppliers, the community, and the environment. You know, we hear sometimes about the triple bottom line, people, profit, and planet. With certified B Corps, we really have 5 or 6 different bottom lines that we monitor and report on periodically. So what kind of work do we do? Well, at Humanity Financial Management, we work exclusively with social purpose organizations and governments. Our sole focus is building internal financial capacity. So we work alongside our clients to improve financial transaction management systems, bookkeeping and accounting systems, budgeting and financial reporting systems, and financial governance systems. We're based in West Vancouver, BC. We have a team of about 20 people, mostly CPAs, and we serve organizations across the country. We have the privilege of working with some, some amazing organizations who are all working in their own unique ways to make the world a better place. And by building better financial capacity, we support these organizations in better serving their communities and in achieving their goals. Okay, now to the content for today's session. First, let me say that I do not profess to be an expert in any of the ideas we're going to be talking about today. I'm really just passing on and reviewing financial and governance practices that we're seeing more and more of in the First Nations and Indigenous communities that we work with and others that we're aware of. We also compare notes periodically with a number of CPA firms that perform audits of First Nations to learn from their experience as well. As certified financial Aboriginal managers, sometimes it makes sense to step back from the daily routines of compliance and reporting and consider the bigger picture strategic issues. Are we providing the best, most useful financial reporting to our users? Do we have the right revenue streams? Are we following wise practices to reduce risk and increase the confidence and credibility in our financial management and financial governance? Are we following the most useful goal setting and performance management processes? Ultimately, are we doing our best to serve our community members and doing everything we can to support them in building wealth and prosperity? Hopefully today will be a reminder or a refresher for many people, but if you're able to take away even just one idea that's useful to your nation, I think it would be time well spent. So we're going to start with a poll question. And this is to see who's online today, just to make sure I can tailor the content as much as I can to the specific audience. So there's 5 or 6 options. Are you working in a First Nation or Indigenous community finance department? Working in industry outside of my community? Working in industry inside my community, but not for the community? Are you a chief or a counselor, an auditor, public practice firm, or a financial consultant or vendor? Please select one of these, or if none of those apply to you, select other. That would be great. Okay, so I presume everybody can see the results. It looks like about 50% of the people are working in their community finance committees, community finance departments, and everybody else seems to be a little evenly spaced through the rest of the categories. So that's great. Thank you very much for answering the first poll question. Okay. I want to start by briefly talking about financial reporting. And in particular, the effectiveness of financial reporting, or the starting point for effective financial reporting, really is strong compliance reporting. And financial compliance activities typically include financial transaction management, or receiving money and paying staff and suppliers, bookkeeping and accounting, or recording financial transactions and summarizing the financial information in useful ways, financial statement audits for external third parties, budgeting and budgeting versus actual reporting, and funder reporting. These are all, for the most part, considered compliance activities and compliance reporting. And some nations and organizations just stop there. They focus on compliance, and that's as far as they get. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of organizations that struggle with even getting this compliance work done and doing it well. So achieving good compliance reporting is actually quite an achievement. But once we've satisfied our compliance needs, we're seeing some nations now and communities are now designing additional financial reporting that helps them set specific goals for financial health, financial sustainability, and financial performance, and then monitor progress toward those goals over time. And the strategic financial reporting includes typically designing a limited number of key financial indicators for financial health, financial sustainability, and financial performance, and then designing graphical dashboards with key financial information summarized to show multi-year trends. And the purpose of this strategic goal setting is to gradually improve the financial health and sustainability of the nation, and to be able to demonstrate progress toward financial health and sustainability to community members and funders. And so here's an example of what a graphical dashboard might look like. Now, this one looks complicated, and there are lots of graphs and no explanations. So it's not a great example. It's the only one I could find on short notice. In a good example, there might be 3 or 4 charts on a page with explanations of trends and the meaning of the information presented, so that readers of the information can easily understand what they're seeing. And the point is that used well, graphical reporting for key financial metrics and indicators can assist particularly non-financial people in understanding the relative financial performance of the organization. Ultimately, we want to build financial literacy in our organizations and provide financial reporting that's strategically useful and in formats that non-accountants can easily understand. And so here are some examples of some of the key financial indicators that some nations might find useful. In order to determine which financial indicators are relevant for your nation at this particular point in its development, you would normally go through a process of identifying the primary financial risks and primary financial opportunities that you're facing as a nation today, and then trying to identify some leading and/or lagging indicators that would help warn you or at least let you know whether you're improving or not. In many of the organizations that we've worked with, we notice that indicators that they care about change periodically as the organization and the environment in which it operates changes. So it's worthwhile to periodically review the indicators that you track to make sure that they're still relevant and to make sure they're tracking the highest priority, either financial risks or financial opportunities. And just as an example, prior to COVID, many organizations relied primarily on budgets versus actuals as their primary indicator for financial performance. Well, when COVID hit, many organizations essentially put their 12-month budgets aside and had to focus on short-term cash flow projections and scenario planning. So making sure that they've got enough cash to pay their staff and suppliers, making sure their funding's still available, and mapping out some different scenarios based on sort of best case, worst case, and most likely case. So the metrics you choose to track and monitor with respect to annual financial performance may change over time as your organization changes. For most organizations, the metrics you choose for financial health and financial sustainability are more consistent and may not change as often. So here are some more financial metrics that are currently being used by the First Nations Financial Management Board to evaluate and certify First Nations financial health and performance. These metrics would likely be in most organizations, top 10 or 15, depending on what's going on at your nation or your community. And now, if you search the internet, you can find hundreds of ratios for analyzing financial health, sustainability, and performance. But many of these are not relevant for either nonprofit organizations or for governments. The challenge is identifying the ones that are most useful for your organization at this point in its particular development. And we usually start by going through a risk and opportunity identification process, as I mentioned, to identify the top financial risks and top financial opportunities, and then identify the best indicators to use to monitor those high priority financial risks and opportunities. Now, a final example that I want to draw to your attention is an organization in Eastern Canada, which primarily works with organizations in Atlantic Canada, but has been doing more work across Canada these days. And the organization is called the Ulnuweg Financial Education Center. And they've been, for a number of years, they've offered a service where they come into your organization and they spend about a month reviewing your last 10 years of audited financial statements. And then they come up with a slide deck of about 25 to 30 key financial indicators, and they prepare graphical financial reports that allow a nation to see how its financial health, its financial sustainability, and its financial performance have changed over that 10-year period. And these guys do a great job of essentially taking audited financial statements that are at best difficult to glean relevant, useful, meaningful information. And they convert them into information that allows nations to understand whether they're improving their financial health and sustainability and performance over time. So all this to say, as CAFMs, again, it's worth stepping back a bit and considering whether we're providing financial reporting that goes beyond compliance and actually helps users understand whether their nations are financially healthy, financially sustainable, and whether they're improving over time. It also allows nations to set specific financial goals and to monitor their achievement of those goals over time. And it really allows some great tools and processes for superior financial planning and ensuring that First Nations are financially healthy and sustainable. Okay, so now, excuse me, poll question number 2. And this is with respect to the level of strategic financial goal setting and reporting you currently do at your nation or community. And if you are a financial consultant or not working in community, maybe just consider the organizations that you know and think about whether you think this strategic financial reporting, whether they're already doing it or whether it's something they might be interested in. We're just trying to get a sense of whether this is a topic that people are interested in or already doing. So here's the first poll. Please take a moment to answer the question. Okay, so there seems to be about 50% of the people suggest that they're not doing as much of this as we could or should. Some are doing virtually none, some a little bit, and some are doing very well. But it looks like there are opportunities for improvement for about 75 or 80% of the organizations on the call today. So that's great to know. Thank you very much. Okay, so as you may already be aware, the Indian Act was enacted in 1876, and Canada has gradually been introducing opportunities to opt out of the Indian Act provisions into new, more modern nation-to-nation relationships. The Financial Management Act was passed in 2005, and the Financial Management Act now provides First Nations governments with opportunities to have more independence and flexibility over their finances outside of the Indian Act, specifically with respect to financial administration laws, local revenues like taxation, and financing for infrastructure and economic development. The Financial Management Act essentially set up 3 nonprofit Indigenous-led organizations, and this is the First Nations Financial Management Board, the First Nations Tax Commission, and the First Nations Finance Authority, to assist First Nations who are interested in transitioning certain aspects of their finances outside of the Indian Act. And we'll go over each of these briefly in a moment. In addition to the Financial Management Act, there was a framework agreement on First Nations land management that was enacted in 1996. The framework agreement on First Nations land management is a government-to-government agreement that was initiated by 14 First Nations to opt out of the land management sections of the Indian Act and to take over more governance and management control of their First Nation land and natural resources. Now, we'll also take a brief look at this in the next few slides, but I wanted to note that the 4 Indigenous-led nonprofit organizations on the slide here signed an agreement to work more closely together in the future to further benefit nations that are turning to them for advice and assistance in the last year, I believe. So starting with the First Nations Financial Management Board. Now, the Financial Management Board, again, is an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization, interestingly, with 3 members appointed by AFAO Canada. The FMB sets financial standards and certifies compliance with those standards. The 3 certifications that are available are the Financial Administration Law, the Financial Performance Certification, and the Financial Management Certification. You can see here that 214 nations have started an implementation of the Financial Administration Law. 175 have been certified for financial performance, and 42 have been certified for their financial management systems, or the actual working of the Financial Administration Law. And some of the benefits of implementing these robust financial governance and management systems and obtaining certification include the following. The primary benefits, I think, are generally more robust financial management and financial governance systems. So this builds or helps to prevent fraud, increases credibility within community members and external funders and business partners. The certifications allow access to new 10-year, less restricted funding from Indigenous Services Canada. The 10-year grant allows First Nations to do the following: better manage finances over a longer period to meet changing community needs, keep unspent funds, so no clawbacks of surplus funds at the year end, reduce the amount of reporting and resources needed to manage your finances, and permit easy transition to the First Nations Financial Management Act. They allow access to lending at government rates of interest through the First Nations Finance Authority, and better access to capital markets. They also allow access to operating under the First Nations Tax Commission for property and other own source revenue taxes. We're working with one First Nation to implement the Financial Administration Law right now, and it's causing us to take a fresh look at all of the nation's governance structures to ensure that they're in compliance with the Financial Administration Law. We expect the project of fully implementing FAL to take somewhere between 2 to 3 years, but the nation's really looking forward to the benefits that come with FAL, including the confidence they expect to have in their financial systems. They have already started receiving the less restricted 10-year grants, so the benefits start coming pretty quickly. And support from the FMB has been wonderful. They've been giving us great advice based on what they've seen work best with other nations. They provided us with tools and templates to assist with the implementation. And our relationship manager there has agreed to attend all of our implementation team meetings to provide guidance and support. Now, the FMB is not going to implement FAL for us. The nations need to do the work themselves, but she is providing all of the guidance and support that we've been asking for, and it's been wonderful to have that kind of support as we go through the process. And with respect to the Financial Administration Law, if you haven't read through it, there's somewhere between 75 and 120 standards or items that you need to look at, depending on which version of the Financial Administration Law you implement. The more recent versions seem to be slightly less onerous with fewer standards, so a little easier to implement. And the categories of standards in this slide give you a sense of the types of standards to expect. So the types of things that you would be looking at if you were going to implement FAL. We go through audited financial statements, and there are certain requirements that your auditors have to take into account when they're doing the audit, and certain disclosures that they require in the audited financial statements. When you're talking about your annual budget, there are certain things they'd like to see in terms of how the budget is put together. For example, they require the budget to be organization-wide, not just for the single main entity. And that can include, for example, all of your economic development entities, limited partnerships, all of the entities that are owned and controlled by the nation. Same with annual report. They've got some very specific requirements that they like to see in the annual report. And I won't go through the rest of the list of these, but there are a significant number of standards which really enhance the financial transparency and accountability, that provide, rules about how quickly financial reports are supposed to be provided to council after each quarter end, how quickly the audited financial statements are supposed to be prepared, how often your finance and audit committee meets, what the terms of reference are for your finance and audit committee, what do you do if you discover financial misconduct. FAL requires multi-year financial plans, I think 5-year plans for the entire organization. So there's quite a number of standards. It is a significant process to go through, and it feels like if you think there are opportunities to improve the robustness of your financial management systems, your financial governance systems, to increase the transparency and accountability, you might want to take a look at the FAL, because if you implement the FAL, it does open up, as I say, these things like access to the 10-year funding, access to capital markets, and access to more flexible own source revenue and taxes. Now, First Nation property taxation is another optional fiscal power for First Nations, and approximately 30% of First Nations across Canada now collect some form of property taxation. Nations can implement property taxes under Section 83 of the Indian Act provisions, or also under the Financial Management Act. But the Financial Management Act has the following benefits: creating certainty over tax jurisdiction, improving First Nations enforcement and related property tax powers, and access to other revenue powers, including property transfer tax, development cost charges, business activity tax, fees for provision of services, and other fees. Operating under the FMA also allows improved certainty to stimulate investor confidence and the ability to lever property tax revenues to access low-cost, long-term financing through debentures. The First Nations Finance Authority's mission is to help First Nation communities build their own futures on their own terms at the best rates. So the intention is to provide First Nations with the same access to capital markets afforded to other levels of government. And this is particularly useful for smaller nations that, due to their size, might not be able to normally get that access. The First Nations Finance Authority provides financing, investment, and advisory services to those First Nation governments that voluntarily schedule to the Financial Management Act. They currently, and this is as of April 2020, I think, have about $840 million in loans to First Nations. And some of the projects they've financed include things like economic development projects, housing projects, community infrastructure, and power projects. So by implementing FAL and scheduling with FMA, you can get access to significant financing at very competitive rates that are normally afforded to other governments, the Canadian government, the provincial governments. So this is an opportunity for many nations. And then there's the First Nations Land Advisory Board. Through the Government-to-Government Framework Agreement on First Nations Land Management, the First Nations Lands Advisory Board is dedicated to supporting First Nation communities in their efforts to reestablish control over their lands, natural resources, and the environment. Among its roles, the LAB provides strategic direction to First Nations Land Management Resource Center, which was established to provide technical, professional support to First Nation signatories as they develop and implement their own land codes. It proposes legislative changes to the framework agreement and federal legislation as directed by the signatory councils, and it advocates for and negotiates funding with the Government of Canada on behalf of the First Nations signatory communities. And you can see from the slide that 227 First Nations as of September 2020 are involved in the framework agreement process. 97 have ratified the framework agreement and enacted land codes. 36 are in the development phase, and 62 have expressed formal interest but haven't yet entered the development phase. And finally, with respect to Indigenous-led organizations that are supporting First Nations across the country with respect to finances, there's the First Nations Market Housing Fund. And this fund helps First Nations evaluate whether they're in a good position to borrow in a healthy way to help their community members obtain ownership over suitable market housing, even where the land continues to be owned by the First Nation. They have a credit enhancement program, which offers some element of loan guarantees and possibly lower interest rates for community members than might be available from banks. Although interestingly, there are some banks now that are competitive with respect to rates. So this is a constantly evolving field, and it's worth certainly checking in with the First Nations Market Housing Fund to see what benefits might be available if you're undertaking some housing projects. Certainly worthwhile involving them in the exploration to see whether there are benefits to your nation by going through the First Nations Market Housing Fund. And they also have a capacity development program that provides funding to work through external consultants to build the First Nations financial capacity for financial management and financial governance, so that they're well set up to borrow well and to make sure that they're borrowing in a healthy way and in a sustainable way. Okay, so now I want to talk about comprehensive community planning. Now, most nations and other organizations do some kind of forward-looking planning for the future. They may create a vision for the future and set some long-term and short-term goals and take actions to achieve those goals, and then monitor the progress over time. And this is no mean feat. Most organizations are great at coming up with wonderful ideas about what the future could look like, but many organizations, including First Nations, find it hard to do the actual implementation. And the whole process of setting up and achieving goals can be complex and challenging, with the result that many nations and other organizations don't have nearly the success that they would like. Comprehensive community planning is a robust, holistic system for planning and goal achievement. It encompasses systems and processes for thorough community engagement, as well as systems for goal setting, monitoring performance, and implementing action plans over time. And based on experience so far, it appears that organizations that make the commitment to ongoing comprehensive community planning are much more likely to achieve their long-term and short-term goals. But also recognize that comprehensive community planning takes a significant investment of time and resources. This is a long-term commitment that should be evaluated and considered carefully. The CPP movement was driven by First Nations in BC, beginning around 2004, although it draws on centuries of community planning experience. Almost half of the First Nations in BC have undertaken a CPP process, and more than 100 in total have started or are involved with that process. Every autumn, more than 100 First Nations community planners gather for a 3-day CCP workshop. Now, only a handful of First Nations outside of BC have implemented the CCPs, but that number is expected to grow as the federal government is starting to support comprehensive community planning in other regions, including the Atlantic region, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. Now, when you commit to the CCP process, you commit to an ongoing process of identifying community priorities, developing goals and metrics for success, developing action plans, implementing those action plans, and monitoring and evaluating progress. It would involve regular reporting back to community on a regular basis and reevaluating priorities, goals, actions, and evaluation processes. And note that even the first 3 steps, identifying community priorities, developing goals and metrics for success, and developing action plans, is taking many nations between 2 and 5 years to develop, even before implementing the action plan starts. So it's a very comprehensive, robust planning process that has a significantly high achievement rate. And these are quite formal processes, and they provide a robust framework for goal setting and achievement. And here's a map that shows communities that participated in the 2020 CCP workshop in October this year. You can see that interest from across the country seems to be growing significantly. What started in BC has spread across the country, and more nations are learning about and implementing CCP. So what is comprehensive community planning? Well, CCP is a planning and goal achievement system that allows nations to set goals and monitor its progress over time in all aspects of its community. So nations set goals with respect to governance, land and resources, health and healthcare, infrastructure development, culture and language, social, and the economy. It's a long-term goal setting and achievement framework that looks at community welfare and well-being using a holistic, comprehensive framework. Now, what are the main differences between the more sort of usual strategic planning and the more robust comprehensive community planning? Well, first of all, strategic planning usually sets goals for a 3 to 5 year period. CPPs, on the other hand, often set goals for 25 to 100 years, so a much longer time horizon in the CCP. Strategic plans usually take from 6 to 12 months to produce. CCPs often take 2 to 5 years to produce, so a much longer, more time-intensive process. And most strategic planning processes have some level of community engagement, but CCPs are often totally driven by community, often without political oversight. So CCPs often have a much deeper, more inclusive community engagement process. And finally, while some funding might be available for strategic planning, I think there's generally now better and more comprehensive funding available for CCPs through Indigenous Services Canada. Now, there are a significant number of resources available for First Nations and Indigenous communities to take advantage of. There are sample plans, toolkits, research, websites, tips, books, grant streams, workshops, and training. Now, ideally, CCPs are facilitated and run by community members. However, there are some external consultants that can help community leaders as they explore the processes required to design and implement a full comprehensive community planning process. And just as an example, if you're interested in this, I'd recommend taking a look at one of the available resources. It's called Measuring Wellness, an Indicator Development Guide for First Nations. It leads you through the process of developing goals and indicators of success unique to your First Nation or community in all of the areas that we talked about earlier: governance, land resources, health, infrastructure, culture and language, social, and the economy. And that's often a significant amount of work, developing essentially a performance management plan, an implementation plan for achieving the long-term vision of the nation in a comprehensive, holistic way. So this may be something that organizations are already familiar with, but for those of you who haven't started down the path yet, it feels like the success of this CCP process has been significantly higher than many of the normal strategic planning processes. It's a much more robust system. and if properly implemented, generally has significantly higher levels of success at achieving the visions and community wealth and prosperity that everybody is working towards. So we have one more poll question, and this is with respect to the level of interest in comprehensive community planning. Just trying to get a sense of whether this is something that people are already organizations are already in the process of, or whether this is something they might be interested in pursuing in the future. Please answer the question. There are 3 options, and we'll take a look at the results in a moment. Okay, so it looks like 46% of organizations on the call today are already involved in a CCP process. 31% are not currently involved, but would like to learn more. And there are about 23% that I guess already have a process that's working well for them. So that's great. Thank you for that. And with that, ends my presentation today, and I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer chat box.
So it looks like we don't have any questions today. Any last minute questions before we end up?
Asking if we can, there's one question asking if we can go back to the agenda. There we go.
And what is the question? Yeah. I don't see any questions.
There are questions in the Q&A deck.
Oh, so what is the risk when your organization has only one source of funding? Well, that's a great question. Well, the risk is that source of funding could stop or be curtailed, or particularly if it's government funding. Many nations are trying to work toward building their own source revenue, which is generally unrestricted revenue, so they can do whatever they want with that, spend it however they like. There is some risk. Who knows what's happening with the governments now with all the spending after COVID, whether they're going to be in the same position to support community organizations or First Nations governments. Hopefully they will, but there's always some risk attached when you only have one revenue streams. Usually having 2 or 3 or 4 revenue streams diversifies your risks and gives you more confidence that your revenue streams are likely to continue into the future. And what's the website for the CCP? I don't know off the top of my head. If you just do a quick search for comprehensive community planning, there's a couple of great sites that come up right at the top of the list. And what is the council's role in FAL? That's a great question. There's actually a listing. You can download actually a copy of the FAL, and you can also download a copy of the, or if it's not downloadable, you can ask FMB for it. They actually have a list of all the things that that council is responsible for, that the senior manager is responsible for, that the finance and audit committee is responsible for, and the senior finance manager or CFO is responsible for. And it's a nice, in fact, it's a list, and it's a bit of a essentially a to-do list. But primarily, council's role is ensuring that if they're interested in pursuing FAL, that the organization signs up and they actually pass the financial administration law, which can be customized to each individual nation. Once the FAL is passed, then the organization is required to implement different parts of the FAL over the next year or two. And again, council's responsibility to make sure that happens. But most organizations will set up a FAL implementation committee, which may be the Finance and Audit Committee or maybe a separate committee, which will do most of the work related to FAL, periodically bringing different pieces to council for approval, because most of implementing FAL is changes to both organizational and financial governance and management practices. And so it requires some people in the organization to do the work, to draft the new policies, to revise previous policies, to design new processes, and then bring those processes and revised policies to council for approval. And typically on the FAL implementation committee, there's usually at least one or more councillors on the committee, so that they can update the council periodically and bring the wishes of council to the implementation committee. So there is council isn't doing all the work, but they're certainly guiding the work and ensuring that appropriate new policies get passed over time. And there's somebody has put up the website for the comprehensive community planning. And Douglas, I should let you answer the question, does staff certification count for being recognized? I don't know, is that for FAL?
That was for FAL, I believe, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's any requirement or standard for having anyone accredited either with the CAFM or the CPA. It does require the organization to ensure that they have appropriately skilled people particularly in their senior positions, but throughout the organization to adequately implement FAL and monitor the ongoing compliance with FAL. Okay, are there any other questions before we wrap up for today?
That looks like that's all of them. So I would like to thank our presenter, Gordon Holley, and all our participants for registering for today's live webinar. I would like to mention that AFOA Canada is offering several virtual training programs, online courses, tax clinic training, capacity development workshops, and our certified courses, including our new Indigenous Human Resources Professional Certification. This week, I'd like to highlight our National Virtual Capacity Development Workshops, particularly the new one-day workshop on not-for-profit board governance, achieving your mission through good governance practices, which is scheduled for November 17th and 18th. This session will be held over 2 half days, and we are offering non-members reduced pricing. This workshop is designed to help you gain an understanding of organizational governance as it applies to not-for-profits, understand the roles, responsibilities, and duties for not-for-profit directors, and to determine how not-for-profit boards contribute to the mission of their organizations. Call the workshop team today for more information or to register. And you can also view the recordings and slides that will be added to the AFOA Canada webinar page. If you register and attend 3 of our webinars in this series, you're entered to win a prize and will be contacted by email. Good luck, everyone, and please fill out the survey, which will appear after the webinar.